when there were still traditions of wisdom that were unbroken from primordial times. That is to say, there was once upon a time a condition of man where wisdom was in an unbroken line of transmission from the beginnings. And man lived like a primordial forest without any idea that he was wise. He had the capacity to continue in that motion of completeness and wisdom uninterrupted until there came a series of circumstances that produced a break in that tradition. The break occurred with the development of agriculture. And with agriculture, there came the rise of urban civilizations. And with that came the idea of empire. And in most areas of the world, the steadfast wisdom of primordial understanding was broken. There have only been really two areas of the world to survive intact: the American Indian and the Indian. And so when we come to Gandhi, we come to someone who learned the tradition after he had grown up. He came into possession of his understanding and wisdom as a man already grown. So for him, it was a great difficulty to be the sage. It was for him a constant need to discipline himself, remind himself every moment, at least daily, and to go on fasts quite frequently, just to keep himself, as the phrase of one writer in the West had it once upon a time, in tune with the infinite. But with Vinoba, we come to a different kind of individual. And though he is a continuer, the continuer of Gandhi, he is a totally different sort of individual. He was raised in a upper-class Brahmin family who had the old wisdom, the old rituals, the way of life handed on for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. For us to form some accurate template of perspective to hold up to what I will give to you for this final month on Vinoba, we need to understand just a handful of basics from the old primordial religion of man. That is to say, the original spiritual perception of man was not witchcraft, it was not some kind of a magic, but it was a perception of the infinite within the container of the finite. And for this reason, as I have given from time to time, the development of ritual forms was to create a sense of durational presence wherein the divinity could be perceived by a direct, wholesome intuition. And those who kept the ancient rituals kept it not as an office of glamour or glory for themselves, but as an unbroken tie line going back to the mists of antiquity. Even, we could almost say, to the archaic, durational intuition of man. There were three qualities that were necessary to be kept intact in this. One of them was sacrifice, which the ancient Sanskrit word is yajna. Yajna. Yajna as sacrifice sometimes is translated in modern English as mission, as in capital M, mission. Someone has a mission. That is to say that a sacrifice is a duty which one must undertake to its completion, that there is no question of doing it halfway or 95%. It must be done 100%. It is a mission. But the correct understanding is that it is a sacrifice. The second quality to be kept is the old word dan. In Buddhism, the first perfection, the first paramita, is dana. And what it means is gift or charity as a quality. Dan is the relinquishing from here outward, recognizing that there is a continuity and a flow, there is a responsibility. The term dan as charity should be understood as a mother and the child. The mother gives the breast to the child to feed. It is a gift of life for that child. She expects nothing. She would be appalled to think that she would expect something from that baby. So dan as charity is a gift, is the giving as the mother gives the milk to the child. Dan is the essential honesty of the sacrifice, so that those making the yajna must have the integrity of the mother feeding the child. The third element is tapas. And tapas is really to be translated as austerity. Tapas, though, is best understood from our standpoint as a discipline. It's a discipline because in tapas, one hones in progressively to an athletic quality of the psyche, where the psychic powers and capacities become translucent and allow for the spirit to flow unhindered by the physical materiality, but also unhindered by the psychic powers, so that man becomes transparent in his highest transcendent self through tapas. And these disciplines, these austerities, produce the experience that one is a sacred chalice, carrying nothing of one's own, able to receive all of the other. So that the yajna has this quality of giving, and with the tapas, it is formed to a purity, a bell-like wholeness, so that when the sacrifice is given, it rings true. It rings not to the ear, but it rings to the sense of wholeness, so that when we see a yajna performed right, it is real. The lack of this reality is what produces all of the neuroses of the world. There is a need then for us in our time to study. And as Vinoba says, there are other things which are not so much faults as shortcomings. One of these is that many of us neglect to study ideas. We do not go to the root of things, with the result that our thinking remains superficial. This has been an old complaint. When I refer to it, I am not speaking of pure academic study without relation to work. But there are certain ideas behind our work that are very deep. If we do not study them and fail to realize their profound content, then the inspiration which keeps us working begins to pale and fall away. The best way for us briefly to hold a mental distinction and comparison is that notions of our own making are conceptions, and we conceive this way, but that ideas are eternal and divine, and ideas come to us from the divine. so that there is a possibility of a congruence between our conception and the idea, in which case we have the enlightening understanding of having seen it true, clear through. What Vinoba is talking about is the profundity of ideas, not of conceptions. And as long as we move on a superficial realm of appearances and images, we do not think at all. The world does not occur to us as real at all. So in order to ensure the sense of reality, the timeless wisdom, called in Sanskrit the stitha prajna. Prajna is wisdom. Stitha prajna is the steadfast wisdom. And the steadfast wisdom is a samadhi state that does not change. It does not fluctuate. And in order to emphasize this, Vinoba, in his great book, The Steadfast Wisdom, gives us in one paragraph the essential kernel of holding together sacrifice, yajna, dan, gift, and the tapas, or austerity and discipline, together into a workable focus. Only the steadfast wisdom holds those three together. And the old ancient image was of the charioteer with the three horses linked together. And it is only the steadfast wisdom that keeps the troika together. He says of it, it is necessary for us to understand the meaning of the word samadhi before we can understand what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. This is a word which gives rise to much confusion. The self-oblivion of meditation is commonly thought to be samadhi. But this is dhyana samadhi, as in meditation, or concentration would be better. D-H-Y-A-N-A. Dhyana samadhi. If to be in the condition called samadhi means not to be aware of anything but what one is meditating upon, there would be no occasion for any of Arjuna's questions in the Bhagavad Gita. He would not know, nor could he learn. He asks how a person in this condition speaks and behaves. Several commentators have, for this reason, divided their study of one who has the steadfast wisdom into two parts. The first concerns itself with the conduct of a person in a state of samadhi, and second, with his conduct when not in a state of samadhi. Though this is ingenious, it is nonetheless mistaken, for it overlooks the fact that the steadfast wisdom described in this part of the Gita is a different kind of samadhi. The samadhi that rises and recedes is the samadhi of meditation, dhyana samadhi. The samadhi of the person of steadfast wisdom is different. It's a different quality, being the samadhi of realization. And if one would wish to give a word, it is jnana samadhi. J-N-A-N-A. It neither rises nor recedes. The quotation is, no spell can bind one who has it. This was the ancient saying. The idea, of course, is that it wasn't just the spell of a sorcerer, but that the net of illusion seen from this level of sophistication is always a spell. Someone who goes into a samadhi from meditation frees himself but falls back into it. But the one of steadfast wisdom never falls, never wavers. It is different. In other words, it is a stable, not a fluctuating state. The samadhi of meditation, dhyana samadhi, is fluctuating. Though it may last 4 or 5 days even, the possibility of its receding is always present. Jhana Samadhi is not like this. So now we move to Vinoba, who has this quality of thought, this refinement of approach, and indeed, we come to one of the great minds of all time. His beginnings, he was born in 1895, September 11th. He was born into an upper-class Brahmin family, not far outside of Bombay. And as a little boy, he was precocious. His father was a very wealthy businessman, and so they were a well-to-do family. There were 4 boys and a girl in the family. The mother was extremely learned in taking care of spiritual matters, and so the household was rather well integrated. But growing up in the early part of the 20th century, it occurred to Vinoba, along with all of his classmates, that here they were rather well off. Indeed, they were inheritors of an ancient tradition, and yet they were being treated by the British as if they were Samis, as if they were just colored people like all the rest of the Indians. And this, of course, wore ill with the upper-class Brahmins of urbane Bombay, and so Vinoba, like his classmates, began to seethe in resentment as adolescents at this treatment. And so Vinoba wrote, when he was 15, a little diatribe against the British, against the injustices and so forth. And he said in his writings, "India, the golden bird of the East, are you, as you were still called in the last century, poor plucked bird? Who has done this to you? We have become the shadow of ourselves, our own malicious caricature which stares back at us with ghastly grimace. For we are in truth the same people that once raised mountainous temples, and they are still standing. But what of us now? We are the same people that used to take a mountain and transform it into statues. But what of us now? We're the same people that once radiated such knowledge and self-mastery that the whole of Asia, if not the world, freely accepted us as law. But what of us now? Sloth, fear, ignorance, they explain everything that we are. And what has done this to us? A century of slavery. We are slaves if it is true, but where is our master to be found so that we may leap at his throat? The Englishman is here, but as though he were not. Every time the Indian would get at him, he finds only another Indian who smites him. We are therefore our own oppressors, in the name of another, like the man who, turning round, slaps his own face because a mosquito has flown away. This is indeed something to make us howl with rage, and the more we shout, we proclaim our distress and become ridiculous to ourselves. And in this hovel of shame and self-ridicule, we are patsies for the British to move us every way that our compulsions come out. And so they toy with us, he says. Well, the well-to-do family, of course, did not like this kind of attitude rising among the eldest of the children. So young Vinoba and several of his schoolmates were sent to visit an old Brahmin who had done a little work with Gandhi and Camparam. And Vinoba went there with his friends, and they scoffed silently at this old man who sat there with 4 split pieces of bamboo arranged around as a spinning wheel. And he was spinning on this homemade charka. And the boys thought, how foolish, what an idiot. And the man, without stopping his spinning, said that he had heard from Gandhi himself that the oppressors are not out there, but in here. And when they are gone in here, they will be gone out there also. So mocking this, Vinoba, of course, felt that perhaps there might be something in visiting Gandhi himself. So he went with a visit, probably because of his mother, whose name was Rukmini Devi. She always encouraged Vinoba to consider that God is real everywhere all the time and never not manifest, and that the beggar who comes to your door is God. Therefore one gives food not to the beggar, but one gives yajna in perfect dham to the divine, who is there in the form of that beggar. Well, he decided that if there were any chance at all for him learning the mystery in this, that Gandhi was the only one that could help him. And so he left his home, never to see his mother again. He looked for Gandhi, who at that time was in the Sabarmati ashram on the banks of the Sabarmati River near Ahmedabad, north of Bombay by several hundred miles. And there he came across Gandhi, and he was spinning on a charkha, just like the old man that he just finished scoffing at. And so he came in, and being a wealthy, educated young man, brash they are when they come from Bombay, he said, "I want to help India. I don't want to waste time." And Gandhi, without stopping spinning, began to talk to him. And he said, "After this war, it is possible," that's the First World War, "after this war, it is possible the revolution may come upon them, the revolution preached by their socialists and sung by their poets, dreamed of and waited for by the world's poor. Then wage-earning, dictatorship, the police, armies, monies, and the machines will disappear? Hardly. But consider my spinning wheel. A full turn of the wheel is called a revolution. The revolution of the stars is a revolution of light. The whole universe spins. It makes a revolution. We've computed in the late 20th century that our galaxy has spun 9 times since it constellated itself out of the primordial mush. 9 times is not very old. A full turn of the wheel is called a revolution. A revolution in man's history should be justice and goodness, a full turn. And this, of course, was the ancient meaning of the turning of the wheel of the law, that the Buddha turned the Dharma chakra, that he turned it one full revolution, so that the completeness of all that is manifested in that turn. And because that turn is a primordial unity, it gives its impress, its emanation to the course of phenomenal time-space, so that in terms of time and space, it comes to be eventually, inevitably, because it was done right once. So Gandhi is telling the young man that my spinning wheel here is making a revolution here. And it is inevitable, if I do it right here, that it turns all of the world in time, one full turn, and everything will be changed. He said, those who want to mock me and my spinning wheel say, you want to put the clock back. But no, my friends, I am the most advanced revolutionary of them all. And I need only let the clock go on, for it will come back to this starting point of its own accord. Time and space curve themselves around. And if we hold to a center line and keep the revolution whole, just like keeping the ritual in its perfection, the yajna complete, the dan pure, the tapas integrity, with the steadfast wisdom, it is already done. There is nothing that can change it. And so the young Vinoba, listening to Gandhi talk this way, setting his pack down, setting his ideas down, setting his anger and his young intellectual restlessness down, to listen to the man in the khadi spinning. He says, a revolution is a return to the first principle, to the eternal. Some men cling to the forms of the past and the memory of the dead, and they live like the dead. Others hurl themselves into foolish novelties until they plunge into the void. I go forward without losing my way, for I am always coming back to the most ancient traditions through a complete revolution, a total but natural reversal willed by God and coming at the appointed time. And I think we've mentioned once that there is a pattern of moving this way and then moving this way. And that creates a presence. And by going through this motion completely, a yajna once done that way has the effectiveness of a mathematical equation uttered. It has the power of the word of creativity uttered. It gives its imprint to phenomenal time-space because the appearances always change in accord with the formulae uttered correctly. Vinoba then decided that Gandhi was to be his guru. And he began to ask Gandhi what he should do, and Gandhi said, you should learn to work. So Vinoba began applying himself in his first lessons at work, at realizing that work for Gandhi was the yajna. It was the sacrifice. The doing of work was the yajna itself. And that one did the work not to acquire possessions, but in order to produce that which could be given. So that the work and the gift were all one motion. And Vinoba, trying to understand this, was put into the kitchen to learn how to cook. And it was the perfect metaphor for him, because making the food was work for him. He didn't know how to do it at first, and yet everything that he made had to be given. And then it was eaten, and then it was part of the people. Where was it? So it was the perfect metaphor. And understanding this was the tapas. Understanding it not just to conceive of it, but understanding that this was a primordial idea made manifest by his teacher in the most mundane of all areas, the kitchen. And the keeping of the integrity of that, the keeping of one's sense of discipline to that, was the tapas. And so, as one would expect, he became a very good cook. Gandhi used to say, why, my son, does everything you make taste so good? And as he did this, of course, because he was doing it with the yajna, with the tapas, with the dan in mind, he began to experiment with what you could change and what you could leave out. And eventually, of course, he began to leave out all the spices and the condiments. And finally, he would end up with a perfect Gandhian diet, the well-peeled mango. His next excursion was scavenging, which in India means cleaning the toilets. Now, it was one thing for Gandhi to clean the toilets, another thing for a high upper-class Brahmin to clean those toilets. But of course, Vinoba seemed to brave not only the smells but the ridicule, and became quite dedicated to this. And while he was doing this over and over again, he one day was noticed by a co-worker that he took from his neck the sacred thread, which every high-class Brahmin is given and always wears, and he took it off, and he committed it to the fire, uttering the words, the ancient Sanskrit words from the Vedas of the sacrifice to Shiva, so that he took the link of his living presence of his Brahmin tradition going back thousands of years and sacrificed that to Shiva. Because Shiva also destroys as well as creates in the same motion. This creates and also destroys the unity of the space. So the same motion. So taking that sacred thread out. So then he replaced his Brahman's thread by learning to spin his own thread from the charka, and then began making his own clothes. And Gandhi could see that his student was understanding, very, very much so. So he had then to apply himself, once he began to wake up to this, to the realization that what we talk about in the colloquial world is charged and filled with meaning, if only we can get to it. That everything that we say is just filled with meaning. And that it is only the profound attentiveness to the daily simple reality that can teach us, because that is where it is. Everything else is wrapped up into the illusion, into the superficialities. And so spinning, for him, became, as Gandhi, the primordial meditation, if we wish to say, but really it was a yajna. It was an ancient sacrifice. So one day they were spinning together, and Vinoba was humming, and then he began chanting. And he was chanting in classical Sanskrit because he was a learned Brahmin youth. And Gandhi said, "What are you singing, my son? Is it not the Gita?" "Yes, Bapuji, it is the Gita." "I love the music," said Gandhi, "but the meaning escapes me, for I do not know Sanskrit. Will you translate for me?" And the master sat at the feet of the disciple, as the disciple had sat at the feet of the master. And Vinoba then freely translating into English his own impromptu translation of the Gita, which someone was noting down. In a community of the alert, there is always someone learning from what you are doing. And eventually, when you realize that, you do everything as openly and as well as you can, because you don't know who is teaching who. And it may be you teaching yourself. And so the flow of gracefulness becomes a characteristic of the real ashram. This was his impromptu translation. "Work maketh us to grow, idleness to decay. The body which lacketh work groweth feeble and is undone. Far from binding to things here below, the faithful soul there is a work, which sanctifieth that which is wrought, in freedom from all desire. Even so do thou work, according to the will of heaven." And so he began like this. And then Gandhi was absolutely astounded at the beauty of the young boy, can we say? Young man. The young man's rendition. And so after that, Gandhi used to go to him whenever he needed to have some Sanskrit word translated, and then he found, of course, that Vinoba was extremely adept at many different languages, and also adept at mathematics. He once declaimed to a disciple, he said, "Next to God, I most dearly love mathematics." And he would always read these very high mathematical excursion texts, and he probably was a great aficionado of Einstein. I don't doubt one bit. While he was doing this, Gandhi became filled with admiration to the memory and the capacity of Vinoba. And he realized that Vinoba had not told his parents where he was. So he wrote the father a letter. And in the letter, he said, "You have no need to have fears about your son Vinoba. He is with me. He has already attained a spiritual perfection to which I myself cannot lay claim in spite of so many years striving." To a visitor who asked once, "Who is that young man?" he said, "It is one of the ashram's pearls, one of those who have come not to be blessed, but to bless, not to receive, but to give." So in this, Gandhi felt that Vinoba probably needed to have a little seasoning in the world. And so he said to him, "I want you to go out into the world. I want you to spend a year just looking around. Whatever you do is your business, wherever you go. But I want you to see the world a little bit. I don't want you to be coming from your sheltered home to the sheltered ashram and not have this connection, this free-form, wild connection of the jungle that's out there." And so Vinoba said, "Very well, I will be back in a year." And so as he went out, he was talked about, and this is, he says, when he came back, a year had flown by exactly. And after prayers at sunrise, Vinoba, bareheaded, barefooted, stripped to the waist, with as little noise as the breeze. It was Monday, Bapu's day of silence. One day out of every week, Gandhi was silent, usually on Mondays. So Vinoba came in, said nothing, went to the kitchen, and sat down and began peeling potatoes. And so everybody sort of starting to take note of him. And at breakfast, Bapu looking, and there's Vinoba coming in to him. And so there was a bond established at that moment between Gandhi and Vinoba. Quite an unusual bond. Now the event was quite interesting because it's like the turning of the wheel of the law. There's always an effect, and if it's wholeness, if it's done right, it has an effect that occurs in time, space, but after a little while. And as those events begin to take shape, they take shape exactly into the form of the wholeness of the pattern that was offered in sacrifice. The unarticulate understanding of this is voodoo, that one can go through an action and produce the sympathetic reaction in the world. And this is truly black magic and stupid. But the real motion is that a wholeness is created. And this wholeness then translates itself in terms of an emanation of a pattern of completion that seeks to find a way to express and manifest itself. So this coming back after 1 year exactly, this punctuality, and this coming back to Gandhi, set up a situation that matured in the following way. There was a very wealthy man, Jamnalai Baji, and he came into Gandhi's ashram a couple of months later, and he said to Gandhi, he said, I have a trap for you. I hope you don't mind if I spring it on you. And Gandhi, I think, was eating something, and he said, yes, what is it? And he said, don't you think that your ashram here, exclusively in Ahmedabad, might be a subtle, egotistical motion on your part? Gandhi's saying, yes, go on. The man said, well, it would be better, perhaps, if there were more ashrams around India to take the onus off and the preciousness away from just this one place. And Gandhi, probably smiling a little at him, yes. So Baji said, I have a place in the center of India. It's a bare plot of land. I would like you to consider which one of your devotees is most advanced, the one that is the cream of the crop. I would like to build an ashram for that person and make all of my wealth at his disposal. Whatever he would like, I would like to do this. And so Gandhi, finishing his swallowing, said, I have just the man for you. And he brought in Vinoba, who was about 21 years old. And the rich, probably corpulent industrialist, absolutely stunned at this boy, because Vinoba had the habit of never combing his hair. In fact, Vinoba was always seeming to be reading or meditating, and he was very frail looking, but very tall. And so he looked like the gangly intellectual of the 1930s. Jamnalaji, looking at Vinoba, then realizing that Gandhi was not playing with him, decided that he would at least give it a try. So they went to get onto the train, and Vinoba would not get in the first-class cars. He went only third class. So Baji had to go third class, and he was thinking to himself, well, this is in keeping. This is how it should be. And so he was sitting there, and he looked down, and suddenly it occurred to him, as it would to a mature man of used to having power and authority in the world, that he's riding with a child, a kid, who's just staring off into space. So he asked him, the way that someone would ask sort of to make sure if they knew what they were doing, he gave him a quotation called a sloka, two-line quotation, from one of the ancient Vedas, and he asked Vinoba to explain this, if he could, to him. And so Vinoba, without looking up, still looking straight ahead, began the most elegant Sanskrit to explain this. And after about a half an hour, Jamnalaj Baji realized that Gandhi had not only chosen for him the most apt student, but had picked his guru for him. And so he had this metanoia, this change, right there in the third class on the train, because he realized that Vinoba was extraordinarily dynamic and complete. So when they got to the center of India, this area called Wardha, about 6 miles south of Wardha, Gandhi eventually would establish his ashram, Sivagram. But in Wardha itself, they established a wonderful little ashram called Mahila, the Mahila ashram. And in the Mahila ashram, to start it off, there were the 11 vows of the Sabarmati ashram. I'll just give you the list later on. After the break, I'll go into them a little bit. The first vow was non-violence, or as we have said, amsa. We start off by saying non-violence, ahimsa. And now I put the words together so that we don't say non-violence, but we say something direct. Amsa. Amsa is direct. Ahimsa is the correct literal translation, but it's something negative. Ah means not. Ahimsa means not violent. But amsa is what we've been talking about, the expression of satyagraha. Remember the flow? The flow is that truth holding, or satyagraha, flows. And as it flows, it becomes amsa. It's the same energy. It's a primal force. But it becomes amsa and comes into manifestation when it passes through this yajna, this sacrifice that's been perfected. That only the universal energy passing through this particular form becomes purified and has the power to germinate and manifest in reality. And that without that yajna, nothing is created, nothing occurs. So this is what is meant by saying, in the beginning was the Word, but the Word achieves form through the light of sacrifice and creates life. And so it is just in this way then that the energy of the universe comes into manifestation and creates. And man, by making the forms, the prisms of his sacrifice, allows for the universal energy to manifest and become. So that Amsa then is not so much nonviolence, but it's the creative power of manifestation from truth.
Is the form named Amsa?
The form here is named, for our understanding, Sarvodaya. It used to be called Brahmacharya for Gandhi, then it changed and became Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya, welfare of all. It means not only of 90%, but all. And it means of all life forms. The plants, the animals, the people, of all. Yeah. The final yajna is the universe perfected. And what will come out of that will be the manifestation of the wholeness of the divine. So nonviolence was the first vow, and you can see how these vows are tremendously potent and powerful. The second one was, of course, truthfulness. You can't have Amsa without truthfulness. They are the same motion. You can say that the one is the origin of the other. But in trying to conceive that, we turn it around and we make it topsy-turvy. You know, the mind, like the eye, turns everything around, turns it upside down. And we don't understand the aptness. We think that the unconscious is in us, and actually the unconscious is the world, nature. And we think that our consciousness then comes from deep inside. Actually, it's projected from out there, that the mind registers, but that consciousness is a flow and is not the content of the mind at all. And so that the truthfulness, the satya, comes from its grounding in reality, so that Amsa is the force of the real. So that truthfulness, the second vow, is held to the first vow by a structural integrity. And the third vow, so as not to bore you, absolute honesty. Absolute honesty. It's not something you get on your tiptoes to reach, but absolute honesty is the veracity of letting truth sink in so that you are completely filled by it. And when you're completely filled by it, its resonance into Amsa is natural and effortless. The cup that is full of water, one more drop will let it overflow naturally, effortlessly. One who is filled with absolute honesty, truthfulness, and Amsa flow without any effort. There's also no conscious registering of it. It happens. Fourth vow was chastity. The fifth was poverty. The sixth was manual work. Temperance, fearlessness, respect for every religion, independence in the matter of money, avoidance of caste distinctions. These were the 11. And it's interesting because avoidance of money became for Vinoba one of the primordial images of what is wrong with the modern world. This exactly is what is wrong. And so, towards the end of his life, the last 30 or 40 years, he would not look at money. And they would not use money at all. And this, of course, became a very sore point with many individuals, because they would say, how can you live without money? And of course he would say, we don't need money at all. We don't need any of this at all. And in one of the conversations with Vinoba, the following conversation was noted down by someone. A man asked him, do you think that khadi and the village industries can solve completely the problem of unemployment? Vinoba answered, if not 100%, then 95%, but only they can do it. Question, but how are we to sell kadi? Vinoba, why sell it? Kadi is made for using, not for selling. The question, but the villager needs money to buy other things. Vinoba, we must free him from money. Oil, flour, sugar, cloth, boots, pots, ropes, everything he needs should be produced, exchanged, and consumed in the village. The village crafts did not die of their own accord, they were killed. Our cabinet sets up milling factories. Is not this the ruin of every family's industry? You first bring about unemployment, and then you ask me how to provide work. In Govindagar, oil presses are worked by oxen, and they were in general use, but ever since the government allowed mechanical ones to be set up, the village presses have been idle. The question, we allowed them because they are perfect means of production. Vinoba, I don't want your perfection. I don't want the perfection of machines. First provide work for everybody, and then introduce as many machines as you like. But you are thinking that without factories, ours will remain a backward country. Such are your magnificent postulates, and they're based on the wind. And the wind is keeping the idea that you have to have money, that you have to have an exchange currency between human beings in order to have an economy. And then he would go in and he would start taking the words like an economic problem, and he would say, this is a contradiction in terms. Economic implies an order, that somebody has a plan. A problem means that there is no plan working. Therefore, the problem arises, that it wasn't prepared for. So he would talk this way, and he would go into it, and pretty soon, what would occur to you is the notion that what we are doing constantly is spinning around using conceptions like money to buy and sell our versions of reality, our opinions about conditions, and never once letting the real settle in and occur to us. Because when it does, the tone that is produced is the old steadfast wisdom. And what it automatically looks to, like the cup flowing over, is to flow where the sacrifice, where the yajna was made. Like a universal energy form, it goes exactly to there. And if there is no there, it doesn't manifest. Well, let's take a break. I always have 15 times as much material as we can work in. So I'm sorry to truncate this, but there are copies of many of these shorter volumes in the PRS bookstore. Vinoba and Gandhi is a case in point. I think it's only about $3 or $4. Many of the Vinoba books are $2, and the copy printings are very small, 2,000 copies, 3,000 copies. Chapter 6 in this is, I do not desire a kingdom. The inherent strength of India's culture was made manifest in everyday practice by Gandhiji. He transformed the work for Swaraj, freedom, into workforce service of mankind. He gave politics a religious and spiritual hue, so that the movement for Swaraj became more than a political movement, with millions taking part in it, some of whom had no interest in politics. Bapu himself was not interested in politics as such. Bapu, even though he had to grapple with political questions right up to the moment of his death, struggled for a wider sadhana, the quest for truth. And of course this happens so often where politics becomes the order of complication of the day instead of the yoga. And it's difficult for those who are inured to the rough and tumble world of innuendos of politics to see in someone like Vinoba or Gandhi anything but naive persons. They're the same kind of jaded people who think of Emerson as being naive, or who think of St. Francis of Assisi as being naive. None of these people are naive. It's rather like you're saying that you really don't like Beethoven's melodic line because it doesn't have any rock. It's totally inappropriate way of experiencing what is there. And what is there is of an integrity that at least common courtesy towards being a somewhat informed human being would expect you to lend yourself a little bit to the situation as it really is. The difficulty with Gandhi was that he was so public, and the difficulty with Vinoba was that he was not public very much at all until he was 56 years of age. I think the best way to convey to you this situation, I'm going to give you a couple of paragraphs from Hallam Tennyson's book on India's walking saint. They called Vinoba the walking saint. Hallam Tennyson was the grandson of the great poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, a very cultivated Englishman. And he and his wife had gone to see Gandhi in India in 1946, and they were unable to catch Gandhi because he was in Calcutta. So someone at the Sivagram ashram said, "Oh, you've got to go and see Vinoba. He's the number one disciple of Gandhi." So they went in this hot weather, 9 miles out to where Vinoba was, and it took them forever to get out there. And they got there at 8:15 in the morning, and somebody said to them, "Well, we expected you earlier. You know, at 6 o'clock, Vinoba goes into study, and we don't disturb him after that." So Hallam Tennyson says, because of the inordinate time, 8:15, we didn't get to see anybody, except they got a glimpse of somebody far into this porch, this arcade, with a white khadi shawl on his shoulders, bent over, tousled hair, and stacks of books around him. So they wrote him off as people who are traveling in their expectations and the imagery that their conceptions give them, right off the very core of what is happening. 8 years later, they visited Vinoba again under different circumstances. Because of his position, Hallam Tennyson got a half an hour interview. So in 1954, he went to see Vinoba, because everywhere he went in India, people were talking about him by that time. So he went into this tent, and he says the loo, the hot wind that blows from the western desert and gathers dust and temperature on the way, was blazing through the tent as if it were a malevolent deity loosed from the gates of hell. After sitting down, I found myself continuously mopping my forehead to prevent my spectacles from misting over with sweat. The legend watched me with a gentle smile and said, "People have criticized me for coming to this part of Bihar for our annual Bhudan meeting." Bhudan means land gift, land charity. "But what does the heat matter when the heart is cool?" And I noticed that although he too was wearing spectacles, he did not need to mop his forehead. I noticed other things. However scruffy and undistinguished one's immediate impression, all the uncontrollable things about him, the things which were unconscious and came from inside, had an extraordinary grace and style and repose. The back was straight as bamboo, the gestures ritualistic, yet at the same time natural and unforced. The wrinkled face, once you had disentangled it from the beard, was completely ageless. It might have been that of a man of 30 or 80. It was an effort to pin it down to prosaic 58. Through it, it shone the eyes of a young man, gray-green and twinkling, as if impatient to break out of the mask becoming to a saint. I had stopped noticing things. My interview was to last for only half an hour. I had the whole agenda to get through. I came to my last question, and he says invariably in 1954, the question that interviewers and journalists ask of great people was, what about the hydrogen bomb? However unexpected this stage might be, I awaited nonetheless one of the stock Indian replies about the hydrogen bomb. Instead, there was a noise halfway between a chuckle and a sucking of breath, and Vinoba said, I don't believe God gave us such weapons merely so we could destroy ourselves. And even if he did, then I wouldn't worry too much about it. It might be helpful in making way for a more successful substitute. My half hour was over, but it had been enough to convince me that the man I had been talking to was self-mastered and utterly given over to God. Under those few square feet of canvas, faith and serenity could be felt like a field of electric force. I stumbled out into the dust and glare, found a bench in the village street, and sat down. Then, sniffing the traditional street smell of sweat and sweetmeats, I took a swig from my vacuum flask. Chlorinated water, lukewarm. Flies and children at once swarmed, as they do, for nourishment. I smiled at both, exhilarated and curiously proud. Then, as I slowly screwed the cap onto the empty thermos flask, I knew that no human being had ever had on me the effect that this man had had in the space of half an hour. And he felt that impressive wholeness. It wasn't an idea so much, it wasn't surely a conception, and it wasn't a perception. There was something else, something more, something profound, had gotten through not just the heat of the day or the circumstance of the man's personality, but gotten through everything to impress him with the integrity that he was, that he no longer represented anything, but that he presented all, and that this was the quality that made Vinoba the leader. Not that he was a political leader, but he was the manifester. He was the one in which truth force had become manifest. And it's something that one knows and is curious about because one didn't really want to know that, hadn't guessed that that was possible, and yet it occurred. And so, this cultivated Englishman had to go back. And this time he went back not as an interviewer with questions in his mind, but he went back there as a human being who had been touched by something he hadn't even known existed. Wholeness, or if you like, wholesomeness, as a quality. And this was what Vinoba really was all about. And in Vinoba's actions, he was attempting to find a way of life that had this wholesomeness to it. And so he was giving up the normal flesh and blood and bones of society. He was giving up money. He was giving up machines. He was giving up political action, party structure, all the elements that were thought to be necessary to carry on life, especially in the 20th century. He had gone in a very curious way down to one of the most neglected areas of India in terms of Gandhian contact and development. In the center of India is Hyderabad state, which was a princely state up until late 1948, even after independence. And the Nizam of Hyderabad was one of the richest men in the world. He always prided himself on having 300 wives that he ran. That sort. And Hyderabad city itself is, I am told, one of those elegant lands that look like Disneyland, if you could imagine Disneyland with a great mind. Whipped cream spun Islamic architecture and beautiful reflecting ponds, and all of it owned by one man. It's mine. Or as Sammy Glick says, and what makes Sammy run, what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. So the Nizam of Hyderabad had held on. The government of India actually had to send forces in. And in fact, they cooperated. The Congress Party cooperated with the communists, and they got armed forces to go in, and the Nizam of Hyderabad, being assured he could keep his 300 wives, decided not to fight too hard. So it had been sort of uncontacted. And yet because the Nizam was out of the way, the communists had not put their guns down, they had hidden them, and started then to undertake this program of taking over Hyderabad state. And it was in a great confusion, and the poorest part of Hyderabad state was an area known as Telangana. Very poor, very anxious, filled with people who have that most fatal of all lures, the promise of instant redress that doesn't happen today. And so they found it hard to sleep that night because they should have better conditions. So in this turmoil, the group that had formed after Gandhi had died, 2 months after he had formed, they made a Fellowship of the Ring. They were going to call it the Satyagraha Mandala, or the Mandala, the Satyagraha Circle. But instead of calling it that, they called it the Sarvodaya Samaj, the Brotherhood of the Welfare of All. It's just like in fairy tale. There really does happen to be a brotherhood of good minds, always somewhere working. So the Samaj, the Sarvodaya Samaj, had held a meeting or two, annual meeting or two, and so they were going to hold this annual meeting in Hyderabad to highlight the fact that the Gandhian solution could go to the heart of the worst problem of the day. Well, Vinoba had said that he wasn't interested in committees anymore, didn't believe in them. He wasn't going to attend. So this shocked the Gandhians, many prominent Gandhians, who by now had become positioned people. Krishnamurti faced the same thing in Ojai. He'd almost disowned his own foundation. They get to where they have the ledgers and the authority, and what are you doing here on our terrain? You know, this is our place. And it's worse when it's in a spiritual or metaphysical institution, because it's not only in bad taste in General Motors, but it's absolutely out of place in other organizations. But there it was, creeping in. So Vinoba didn't want to play. He doesn't play games. And he was very good at picking out the very elements that are toys for people and laying them on the table of discussion and pointing them with great preciseness in his language, and then saying, is this what you want me to do? Play with these things? So he wasn't going to go. So they finally said, well, we're going to have to cancel it. So he sat quietly, by report, in this meeting for about 10 minutes. And he looked up and then he said, I'll go. But what he meant was, I will go. Not I will go to attend, but I will take whatever I am because I don't know how to carry on. since Gandhi's death, we haven't done anything really effective. He had gone to Delhi for a few months. He had given the prayer speeches in Delhi for a while. And he could see that people were making him fit into the shoes of the master. Nice prayer speeches, filling in. We've got a substitute. And he couldn't do that. So he'd let that go. He'd let a dozen things go. And he was looking for something to manifest Amsa. He had kept intact, like Job, his satyagraha, never let go of it. But there was no current. There was nothing manifesting. And so, like a real timeless hermetic seeker, like a real rishi, instead of having a plan in his mind, he took all that he was and put it in motion. And whatever would happen, would happen. And so he began to go to Hyderabad by walking hundreds of miles. He said once that walking is the correct pace of thinking, that the alternation of feet is just the right rhythm for thought. And that long walks, and by long walks he means hundreds of miles, you purify your thought. There is a second wind that comes mentally also, only instead of being reinforced by more conceptions, it gets tired of having conceptions, so it just is and presents awareness. And then after a while, you lose track of it because there's no way to calibrate the sense of awareness. And when that goes, then clarity seems to just occur. And so that's what he was doing. And all the way he was walking to Hyderabad, he set for himself a tone, sort of like a pitch, to get the music going in the right key. And the tone was, there must be some motion of manifestation of Amsa for Sarvodaya. There must be some way to move, something to do. And when he got to Hyderabad state, he was in the Telangana region, and there was a little village way out of the way. A European named Delanza, who went there, said that there was no road there, that you had to drive over fields, really. And there were palm trees and scrub and lots of water, very few crops, and the villagers were impoverished, but in a colorful way. They had beautiful, colorful turbans, and the women had all the bangles and jewels and everything. So they were poor, but they had lots of things. Vinoba used to say of 6 sets of earrings that the women were bearing the burdens of the husband's sins. All this wealth accumulated for nothing, for show. So we got to this village, and the brothers who were holding all the property there, one of them very pompous, kind of the largest sort of individual, who was always proud of showing his workers' hands to people, flailing these big leathery shovels of hands and saying, well, I've worked. So he could justify it to himself, holding all this property. And finally, sitting with Vinoba, the villagers, the untouchables, especially the Harijan, some 40 families who were starving to death, had asked Vinoba to do something, and Vinoba had taken this problem in. And in the midst of all this flailing and camaraderie, he sat there, and the host noticed that he was crying. And this cut through, this penetrated through. It was very bad form to even see a rishi cry, but in your household. So he stopped the charade. He stopped all of the acting, even to himself. And in that moment, Vinoba looked up to him and said, I want land for the peasants. I want you to give the land to me, and I will hold it in trust with it. And it was true. it was true. And the man gave 100 acres. He didn't give it because he thought of it. He gave it in the dan mode because Vinoba had gotten through to him. It created the sacrificial moment. And that man responded because it was the effortless, right thing to do. And he took that 100-acre slip, had it notarized right away because Vinoba was sharp. And he went out and he held that out to these 4,000 or 5,000 people that had gathered. And that was the beginning of the manifestation of AMSA in the form of land gift mission, Buddhan Yajna. So in a volume I had bound about 15 years ago, his first little book published was called Buddhan Yajna, land gift mission, or really what it means is the sacrifice that allowed for this to happen. And he says right here in the beginning, "My dear fellow countrymen, I was touring Telangana during the summer of the last year. All the while I was thinking of the grave problem confronting the people there. At one place, at the request of local Harijans to get some land for them, I asked the village people to donate sufficient land for them. The people acceded to my request, and I received the first Bhumidan that day. This was on the 18th of April, 1951. This is how the idea of Bhumidan Yajna came to me, and I tried it during my Telangana tour. It gave encouraging results. Within a period of 2 months, I received about 12,000 acres of land. About 12,000 acres of land. Within a few years, he had received 4 million acres of land and become the largest technical landowner in the world. 4 million acres is like Connecticut and Rhode Island and several other parts of Long Island thrown in. And he went on for 30 years after that. This is quite a story. I had been trying to find some field for experiments with nonviolence since Gandhiji's death. I took part in the work of rehabilitating the Mio Muslims with this very idea. It was a good experience. It encouraged me to go to Telangana. I saw there the vision of AMSA in the form of Buddhan Yajna. That is to say, he was not looking for an intellectual form. He was looking with his wholeness intact to find a congruence in activity that would allow to manifest the wholeness. So he was holding in offering the wholeness that he had in trust, and he was looking for somewhere to have that soul force, that energy, take manifestation. And in order for it to take manifestation, there had to be a response from the others, from the physical world. They would make the chalice through their gift, and he would put in the wine of renewal from his wholeness. And together, coming together, would make the event. And the event thus made, with that magic involved, would become real, in the sense that it would not only exist there for those people, but would resonate for everyone else that would come into contact with it. And so he began walking, not only from Telangana, but then he walked north to New Delhi. He walked all the way over to the historical land of the Buddha in Bihar, and went around Bodh Gaya. And I have a lot of that story recounted, but I want to give you in here his description of Sarvodaya, and he writes this way. This is in a little book called Sarvodaya. It's Principles and Program. It costs 40 cents. We've got copies in the bookstore. 40 cents. The Sarvodaya Samaj is like an ocean, the depth of which no one has yet fathomed. but it is an ocean of nectar in which there is no fear of being drowned to death. One can swim in it without any misgiving. It is vast in every direction. One may leap into it singly or in company with others, keep on the surface or dive beneath and stay in it as long as one pleases. The Sarvodaya Samaj is free from organizational control. There is no external authority. And this was the key. He said that all isms in our time are going to flow into this ocean, because this ocean is not the product of a conception, but is an eternal idea that manifests naturally when the truth soul force vibrates through a social structure. And that because they had seen this in actual fact time and time again in conditions that differed so radically that it was obvious finally that it was happening not because of individual conditionings, but that it was a universal idea. That it is true in a real way, in an eternal way. That once man creates a social form of integrity and allows soul force to flow through it, it will produce this ocean of brotherhood, this Sarvodaya Samaj, which eventually is not composed of members exclusive of others, but of all mankind. Thus the whole notion of authorities goes out the window. The whole notion of organization in bureaucratic terms is meaningless. And because it's meaningless, then, of course, everyone who earns a living or earns their sense of egotistic reality through their positions in this, through their participation in this, would be against it naturally. Naturally. You would expect it. He says, talking about the words, the meaning of the words down. The meanings of the word dan used in these yajnas must be clearly understood. Dan has so far meant one's giving something to the other as an act of pity or spending something for the sake of one's own good in the other world. However, Vinobaji is using it in a different sense. He tells us that Shankaracharya has defined dan as equitable distribution. Equitable distribution. It means a distribution based on justice and equity as one finds among the different members of a joint family. It is this sense of equitable distribution that Vinobaji employs the word dan. Now, when you think of equitable distribution, if you're thinking of mankind as a whole family, then the equitable distribution can no longer be parceled out for this group or that group, but the entirety of the earth is for all. And so one of the great chants of Vinoba was Jai Jagat, victory to the world. Not to someone's conception of it, not the world as an empire, not the world as an authoritarian structure, but the world as the whole natural theater for this family to manifest itself. So that equitable distribution, so that dan, all of these words began to have a cosmic resonance in Vinoba's usage. But in order for this to appear understandable, Vinoba time and time again would go into the basics, to the fundamentals. For instance, how is wealth created? How is this done? How do we come by wealth? It would be appropriate to consider first as to how wealth is created. It is wrong to regard gold or silver, money and metal, and paper currency as wealth. They are only tokens of wealth. Wealth consists of only those things which man can actually consume in one way or other, while some among them are such without which man cannot even exist. Some are meant only for pleasure and luxury. Man's basic necessities are food, clothes, and house, without which he cannot live. Besides, there are other things without which man cannot get on very well. Now, how are these articles called wealth produced? They have not come by themselves, nor are they dropped from the sky. None brings them with his birth. On the other hand, birth gives rise to some necessities whose fulfillment requires constant exertion and struggle. All these articles of use are products of the physical labor performed with the different materials found in nature. Thus, there are two main sources of wealth: natural material and man's own physical labor. And again, these come together. These come together. Some articles seem to be produced by machines, but these machines are in turn the product of physical labor, as the operation of machines too require physical labor in some form or other. So what he's getting around to is that if our labor is considered in terms of a sacrifice, a yajna, then whatever we are doing will carry that impress of wholeness with it. That yajna, that tapas, will actually go into it. And that eventually, more and more people doing this, creating, manifesting, with that tapas, with that dhamma, with that yajna, so that the steadfast wisdom will come back into manifestation, not in an idol, not in an idea in the mind, but in fact in the so-called wealth of things that are made and produced. And they will then have a reality which will resonate. They will resonate. So he says, given this perception of wealth, of things, what can we do? The only thing we can do then is be trustees of this wealth. We can't own it. How can we own it? How can we own the steadfast wisdom? How can we own the tapas that has been put in? We cannot. So that the notion of trusteeship became paramount for his thought. He says, we use a very small part of our wealth for our own benefit, when you actually think of it. Most of it is employed for big industries which cannot be run without large capital, and which produces articles for mass consumption. All our enterprises provide employment to many people who would otherwise have no means of livelihood. Thus we are rendering service to society in a way with our wealth. If we allow for hoarding, it tends to bring this whole process to a standstill. So that we need to have this notion of trusteeship. And in this, then, there is a sharing called sampadidana, a sharing of wealth in the sense of sharing of land, in like Buddhan yajna. There's a sampadidana yajna of sharing one's wealth. 1/6 of the income was the code. And along with this, then, there was a sharing of intellectual capacities. All of these then began to have terms applied to them. And as Vinoba went on in his work, there came finally an assessment about 1959, 1960, called Sarvodaya after Gandhi. A very fine study that actually, I think, only had 3,000 copies printed in it. And in this study, it occurred to people by the late 50s, when the Buddhan Yajna movement had created so many small villages They were called gramdans. Gram is a village. The gift of whole villages was being made. Instead of just the land, the entire village was being given, not so much by wealthy landowners, but by the people themselves. The community of, say, 500 people or 700 people or 1,000 people would get together in the evenings and they would talk this over through months, and then they would decide that the entire village would give themselves to this movement, and that their village then would be considered a gramdan, a village gift, and that the entirety of the village then would be run in a way where, as Vinoba said, what you can produce, use, and what you can't produce, don't covet. So that they would take this village out of the economic structure where they needed money, out of the economic structure where they needed authority, and out of the political structure where they needed something from the state or from the national government. And so, of course, when they wouldn't ask for anything, they would receive no attention, and all this would be written off. Well, we'll see as we go on that as the number of gramdans began to rise into the tens of thousands, it began to create a real problem for those in authority. Because if they don't need your authority, what good is it? And if they don't need anything from you, how are you going to control them? And if they're acting in truthfulness so that when you threaten them or talk to them or bait them, they educate you, you have trouble finding the right people to send to them to convince them that they're doing wrong, because the people don't come back. They stay in the villages. They work, they join them. So as he became successful, Vinoba became a problem for the government of India. And one of the real great heroic figures of 20th century India, a man named Jayaprakash Narayan, who used to be a Marxist bomb-throwing radical in the 30s. And he was also a very flamboyant character. He was sort of the Johnny Weissmuller of India, a real handsome devil, that sort of a character. He wrote a foreword to this, and in it he said, "Revolutionary and pathfinding thinkers in history have usually been followed by mere interpreters, systematizers, analysts. There have been rare exceptions. Vinoba is such an exception in the case of Gandhi. The others, and I include myself among them, have elaborated, elucidated, and interpreted, particularly in terms of conditions and problems of independent India and of the world since Gandhi. But Vinoba has experimented and innovated, thereby saving Gandhian thought from becoming pontifical and authoritative, and it preserves its creative adventurousness, its boldness. And in this boldness, Vinoba began to actually manifest a new world order. And in the next 3 lectures, we'll be able to take a closer look at this. And I think it might be of interest to you. Maybe I should save it for next week. I'll save some of this for next week, where the problem with Vinoba was that he was extraordinarily intelligent. He had had enough time to learn all these languages. He could speak to everybody in their own language. He had read everything there was to read worthwhile. So when people began to argue with him, he not only knew what they were talking about, but he knew all the different logical forms, and he was a master of mathematician. He was able to take what they would say and show how shallow their thought was, and not only that, how shallow their expression was. And when he finished, usually people were reduced to this almost pathetic silence. And then he would smile at them and ask them to make a gift or something for the poor. So we'll see some more of Vinoba. He becomes more and more a character. Thank you.